I've spoken about We3 before on the show, specifically about how it deals with three-dimensional space, and for the Patreon page I wrote about some of the non-verbal language the book employs. But the big thing that We3 probably gets remembered for is the way it deals with movement through a comic book page. This big splash is probably the most famous moment from the book, for example. As with a lot of Morrison and Quietly's work together, there's a lot to take from this comic, so I wanted to dive back into We3 to discuss the various options for showing movement through a comic book page it employs and how each of them work. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So there's actually 4 different ways Morrison and Quietly show progression through a page, and each has a slightly different use in a way. They all show progression, but they also each have a separate quality that aligns them to be used in a certain way as well. Okay, so if we start with that obvious example from the start, the big famous one, in this case the movement is created by presenting a 3-dimensional space on the page. It makes sense in theory, if you take a series of panels on a flat page as moments of time, that if you then took them and placed them one in front of each other, almost like you were stacking up dominoes, you could essentially see the timeline. This page posits that essentially each single image is a moment of sequential time, so rather than see them just placed left and right next to each other, if you place them directly in front of each other, they create this kind of interesting timeline. Morrison and Quietly put them one in front of each other so you can see that time passing physically from left to right on the page. It takes the cat character and uses that as a way to bridge the time between the panels, showing movement not just through time, but also through space. And I feel like this is Morrison and Quietly trying to explain what comics would look like if we could see them from the side, rather than just from the front. And it's an interesting effect, and not just because it's very bombastic. In one sense it works as a visual flourish, a kind of bake-off showstopper moment for the book and its creators, to use a British reference, to really make an impact on the reader. And the takeaway is that it's likely hyper-realistic, it's kind of like a larger-than-life action movie spectacle, but in comic book form. When everyone has the budget to blow up everything in every issue of comics, how do you make moments like this really stand out? Okay, well Morrison Quietly here have a good suggestion on how. But from a story point of view, it also cleverly frames the focus here specifically on the character of the cat, one of the 3 leads in the book. The violence the cat is enacting is almost secondary to the beauty, the swiftness, and the simplicity of the attack. The cat makes it look easy, essentially, where the faceless soldiers offer almost nothing in return, because while they're just confined to the panels, the cat has this kind of sixth sense to move so swiftly and effortlessly through time, they're almost powerless to stop it. And it does all that, and it says all that, but it also wraps it around some spectacularly gorgeous and impressive visuals. And I think that really is a big takeaway for me for this moment. So much of it is about, yes, okay, showing how time works in comics, but it also does that through this ridiculously over-the-top image. And it's the image in this case, I think, more so than the effect that sticks with you. And another method used is much less flashy than that, but it works in a more traditional way that doesn't disrupt the narrative engagement of the reader in the same way that I would argue the previous example probably does. You'll have seen this in many comics, and likely after seeing it once or twice, it doesn't do much to pull you out of the story anymore. It's much more commonplace. And this is the idea of a triptych, or any form of a longer image being split up by different panel edges. So in this example, you've got the same cat crossing over the same space in 4 panels. The background of those 4 panels is actually the same image. If you remove the gutters, it would just be one large panel. But by placing the gutters there, they generate different elements of time. So we see the cat close on the first panel, and then moving further and further away before they cease to exist by the final panel. And this is one of my favourite effects for movement, because it's just so obvious and simple. Especially in the last 3 panels here, you just understand what's going on with this cat without it really pulling you out of the narrative, which is always a balance you're making when you want to do something flashy to get an effect across. Here it just works, you understand the progression across the scene from left to right, and the gutters block any confusion from multiple versions of the same character in the same image or anything else like that. It does sort of limit movement to be mostly left to right. You can have a character move from the foreground to the background, but they do have to be doing it left across to right. And that's because you're working against a whole backdrop. Again, each of these techniques has its own limitations, but the triptych-like approach is a really good one for horizontal movement. Some of you are going to argue that of course you can do vertical movement that way, and of course you can. If that panel was instead from top to bottom of the page, you could show someone doing top to bottom movement, but again, it essentially just works on a single axis. And the third example is a slight variation on that technique, which works by changing up the scale of the images and a slight positioning, therefore making it look like a series of repeated images rather than one long continuous one split up. So there's a way of getting around the previous problem of having a sense of more dynamic 3-dimensional movement along the Z-axis. And I do love this sequence, especially because of how it adapts the typical triptych approach. Rather than using the same backdrop and just drawing the character small on the left side, then larger in the middle, then big at the end, Quietly actively makes the panels themselves much smaller. almost like it's inviting us to squint and cause real distance. It also means the transition from panel 2 to 3 can be extra dynamic because of the sudden jump and larger image. As with a lot of these, it's pretty simple, but it works by making the panel larger while also zooming in on the scene at the same time, and bringing the character closer as their movement propels them. So the second panel physically takes up more space on the page than the first. The character is a little closer, but also the frame is zoomed in more. You can see less of the truck on the right side as the camera is placed closer to the animal. So it's not just the animal getting closer, but we're also moving closer to the animal, those two things happening at once causing a more dynamic sense of movement. As I say, it's simple, but really effective at getting the movement across through space. And the final one is somewhere in between those examples and the first. It's where Morrison and Quietly have a scene playing out as normal, and then a series of smaller panels around that scene that show progressions within them. It's a bit easier to see than to explain, so if we take a look at this page for example, there's the animals ripping through this truck. So the scene itself is visible in this big panel, we understand the whole visual, but then they close in on a series of smaller images to show various bits of movement throughout. If you look at the first tier of these small panels, there's a sequence of the bullet ripping through the head of the soldier in the jeep, blood splattering after it. The fourth tier shows metal crunching against the flesh, the bottom tier shows the foot falling away from the gas pedal, teeth bouncing, all that good stuff you need for a gritty action moment. So it's actually creating a sense of movement through the smaller panels being stacked left to right to create some eyeline movement. But it also does this by repeating panels too, showing the difference between them like the pedal here. The main overall look is the chaos of everything moving, which is where this style excels. To me, the clarity of the movement is never lost, because as with much of the approach in We3, it's all about layering visuals. So the grounding is there in the background elements, and the foreground is for all the bits of minutiae. As with the first example, it is visual bombast. It's a way to show off a cool flourish, but still giving important story information. And I think that last point is pretty important with the way We3 deals with a lot of the approaches in there, because this is really an action movie in a comic. So Morrison and Quietly aren't just looking for ways to show movement in the comic book page, but they're also looking for ways to show movement in these really big, bold, sort of larger than life ways. Because that's the action movie trope required to make this work. Ultimately though, We3 is a fascinating comic to look at when it comes to clever tricks for dynamic movement. There is loads to learn in just these 3 issues, and a lot to say about the way comics present themselves as 2-dimensional images in 3-dimensional spaces. It's good stuff, is what I'm saying. Thanks for watching. Strip Panel Naked continues to exist regularly because of the amazing support from the patrons, who get access to years worth of exclusive extra writing and content. I'd love your support too. You can find me on Twitter at HassanOE, and the Eisner-nominated magazine I edit at panelxpanel.com. As always, hit subscribe and that notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I'll see you next time.